Hello. Today we'll be talking about regulation and legislation, and what that legislation basically talks about laws that are made so that different kinds of laws that are passed for whatever reason. And when people in Congress pass laws, we call that legislation. Regulation basically talks about the kinds of rules that we have. So we're going to talk about regulation and legislation in terms of rules and laws when it comes to the economy. So first we recall the market and command economy, and we to remember the extent of government intervention in the different kinds of economies. We remember that in a market economy, there is very minimal government intervention. We don't see the government doing much. The government usually gives a lot of freedom to the producers and consumers involved, and they try to stay out of it. In a command economy, as we studied earlier, the government controls everything, and that's oftentimes like a feature of common economy, the high degree of government intervention. So we regulation and legislation are basically tools of government intervention that's often used in different kinds of economies. Just because regulation and legislation is used doesn't make an economy a command economy. Most of the time it ends up being a mixed economy because you have legislation like laws and regulation like rules about some things but not about all things. So let's look at some important definitions, like what of some of the things we're going to cover with regards to regulation and legislation. The first thing we're going to cover is the labor movement, which is basically workers coming together to fight for worker rights. What that basically means is that workers in the market economy or in a particular kind of economy see that they're not being given sufficient rights, they're not being paid properly, or they don't have good working conditions, and then they come together to kind of have this kind of labor movement to fight for the rights. Then we have labor unions, right? What are labor unions? Labor unions are basically organizations of workers that usually fought for the rights of workers and often negotiated with employers. Employers didn't like this because labor unions meant that employees had more power, which was a bad thing because that means that employers had to pay more money. So oftentimes employers were against labor unions and labor movement. It is important to note that labor movements oftentimes led to labor unions being formed by virtue of the fact that they campaigned, they had a movement, and that allowed them to form labor unions. We already talked a bit about regulation, but let's look at a few examples. The rules and restrictions that are put in place by the government, such as the Pure Food and Drug Act, which basically is make sure that the quality of food that we have is good, that it's not poisonous, that it's not harmful for our bodies, and that there's certain minimum standards that's met before those food can be sold on the market. That's what the Pure Food and Drug Act does. There are restrictions on carbon dioxide emissions. You might have heard about climate change that's harming the country right now, that's harming the world right now. So there are restrictions increasingly and regulations about carbon dioxide emissions. We have regulations about seatbelts in cars because guess what? We don't want people to die from traffic and road accidents. So that's why we want seatbelts. And there have also been regulations in the past about children not being allowed to work because we saw in the past how oftentimes young children, instead of being given an education, they're being forced to work. So these are like different kinds of things, are examples of regulation. One of the most important regulations that will be covered in economics and you'll hear a lot about is the minimum wage. A minimum wage is basically the idea that you get a fixed amount of like money per hour that you work, and I'm sure you already know about this. The base minimum wage right now is very low. It is usually the idea is to have this kind of minimum wage because we want to prevent exploitation, because we don't want workers to be treated like slaves. We don't want them to get to act as unpaid labor who are not rewarded for their efforts. So the base minimum wage does exist. At the same time, the base minimum wage is not enough because it's very way too low. It's like right now the federal minimum wage is 7.25, which is absurdly low. Like that's not a living wage. So there have been calls to increase it to $50. And the whole idea of minimum wage is it's a regulation, it's a legislation that can be passed. Like let's pass minimum wage legislation. Let's pass some regulation to make sure that employers have to pay people the minimum wage. One thing on the minimum wage that we like that allowed for people to fight for the minimum wage was the Wagner Act. As you can see here, it guaranteed workers the right to set up unions, and it was set up in the 1930s. The Wagner Act is important to kind of learn. This is the Wagner Act. because it allowed for legal setup of worker unions that eventually allowed for people to fight for the minimum wage. The last thing that we kind of want to take a look at is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We've already talked about, okay, we are talking about econ, we're talking about regulation and legislation in terms of econ, right? So we're looking at the labor market a lot because a large part of econ has to do with the employees, the labor. Remember when we talked initially about the like we're at the beginning we were talking about scarcity, we are talking about the four economic factors, labor was one of them. Now we're circling back to it in terms of talking about regulation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed with regards to regulating the kinds of practices and the kinds of behavior that was allowed towards this labor that we've been talking about. And it was used as a regulatory tactic to combat discrimination. It was basically a rule or like a law to combat discrimination. What kind of discrimination are we talking about? Civil Rights Act of 1964 basically said that you cannot refuse to hire someone just because of their gender or just because of their race or just because of their religion, for example. You cannot refuse to hire someone just because they are Muslim, or you cannot refuse to hire someone just because they're black. Those kinds of things are not acceptable, and they could be legally prosecuted because of the Civil Rights Act. It also set up a commission beyond just combating that kind of discrimination, and that was very prevalent back in the day, and is also still prevalent today to a lot of degree. It was also allowed to set up a commission to protect and support workers to make sure that employees were following the law. And that was super important because employers were following the law. Because it's not enough to just kind of have this law. It's also important to make sure that the people are following the law. So the Act of 1964 also set up this commission to make sure that people and businesses and employers were following the law and were holding accountable, basically meaning that like they were punishing people or they were like often putting people in prison if they didn't follow those kinds of laws properly. Let's look at some example questions and that we're gonna kind of do. Let's look at the example questions here. We're gonna do this. The vocabulary. Let's look at question number one. The dash guarantee the right of workers to organize. What do we talk about? This one's labor union, because we talked about the labor union guarantee the right of our workers to organize. Try 2 and 3 by yourself. Let's do number 4. Workers who join a dash work together for better conditions and pay. Wait, I apologize. Actually, the number 1 is actually the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act guaranteed the right of workers to organize and create labor union. That was my bad. The Wagner Act guaranteed the right of workers to organize. And number 4, workers who join a labor union work together for better conditions and pay. Because as you already covered, the idea of labor union is you come together, you work together for better conditions and pay, and you can join a labor union. The Wagner Act basically guaranteed the rights of workers to organize. I apologize for the slight mistake. Let's look at some skills practice. Number 5, which of these was not a problem in business by the early 1900s? Workers had few rights. This was the problem. Government supported a market economy. That was not a problem. Businesses used false advertising. This was a problem. Children worked instead of going to school. This was also a problem. If you read the textbook, and I'm sure you have access to the textbook, you will notice that B was not a problem. It's important to notice here they're asking which one was not a problem as opposed to asking which one was a problem. So it's important you kind of make sure you understand what the question is asking for. You can try 6 on your own. Let's try, you can also try 7 on your own. Let's try number 8. Let's see if you have number 8. Let's if you can do number 7 on your own. Number 8, how did the Civil Rights Act of 1964 affect the economy? We just talked about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It placed new regulations on hiring practices. This is true because we were talking about regulations on hiring practices. That means the way people were hired. That means that you couldn't discriminate based on people's different identities. So this one is the answer. You can look at the different answers possible, be it protecting the right of workers to organize, which is a good thing, but that's not what the Civil Rights Act did. That's what the Wagner Act did. Remember? Yeah. See, it limited what kind of speech could appear in advertisements. It had nothing to do with speech. It helped minority entrepreneurs start new businesses. It had nothing to do with that either. This is it for this lesson, but we're gonna have another lesson just covering the unit test and reviewing all the questions on that unit test. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope this lecture helped understanding the minimum wage better, the Civil Rights Act, the Wagner Act, and what regulation and legislation essentially means. Thank you.